History remembers some battles with vivid clarity: D-Day, Waterloo, Thermopylae. But what about the clashes that slipped through the cracks? The ones where blood was spilled, fortunes changed, and yet their stories faded into obscurity. Today, we're stepping onto battlefields time forgot, where the echoes of clashing steel and desperate cries still linger in the dust. These aren't just footnotes, they're turning points that shaped our world, then vanished from the spotlight. From a brutal siege that decided the fate of empires to a midnight skirmish that altered the course of a revolution, we're unearthing 25 forgotten battles that deserve a second look. So ready your curiosity, because history is about to rewrite itself. Long before the Roman Empire reached its height, there was a defeat so devastating it nearly brought the Republic to its knees, yet few remember it today. In 105 BC, near the quiet hills of southern Gaul, two Roman armies marched out to face an unstoppable tide of warriors from the north. The Cimbri and Teutones, tribes from the mist-shrouded lands beyond the Rhine, had been carving a bloody path through Roman territory for years. What followed was the Battle of Arausio, a catastrophe that dwarfed even the infamous defeat at Cannae. Rome threw the full might of its legions into the fight, but poor leadership and bitter rivalry between its generals turned the battle into a slaughterhouse. Nearly 80,000 Roman soldiers fell in a single day, men swallowed whole by the chaos of war, their bodies left unburied under the southern sun. For context, that's more Roman dead than in any other battle in history. The defeat was so total, so humiliating, that Rome panicked. Consuls scrambled to fortify the city, fearing the northern hordes would march straight to their gates. Yet somehow Arausio faded into obscurity, maybe because Rome, ever the master of reinvention, turned disaster into opportunity. The man who finally crushed the Cimbri and Teutones, General Gaius Marius, used this defeat to overhaul the entire Roman military. His reforms, opening the legions to landless volunteers, standardizing equipment, laid the groundwork for the professional army that would conquer the Mediterranean. So why does Arausio remain forgotten? Perhaps because Rome's greatest trick was spinning collapse into rebirth, burying its darkest hour beneath the glory of what came next. But the ghosts of those 80,000 still whisper from the forgotten fields of Gaul. The world held its breath in the year 451 as two colossal forces collided on the open plains of Gaul, one led by the infamous scourge of God himself, Attila the Hun. This wasn't just another clash, it was a last stand for the fading light of Rome. The Battle of the Catalaunian Plains pitted Attila's unstoppable horde against an unlikely alliance, the Romans clinging to their crumbling empire and their old foes, the Visigoths. If this sounds like the plot of an epic saga, that's because it was. A real-life twilight of gods and empires playing out under the summer sun. Attila had spent years carving a path of destruction across Europe, leaving smoldering cities in his wake. By the time his army reached the Catalaunian Plains, many believed resistance was futile. But Rome's general Flavius Aetius, a man as cunning as he was desperate, pulled off a masterstroke. He convinced the Visigoth king Theodoric to join forces against the Huns. For the first time, the so-called barbarians weren't just enemies at the gates. They stood shoulder to shoulder with Rome to face a greater threat. The battle itself was a swirling tempest of blood and dust. Attila's horsemen, feared across continents, charged again and again, but the allied lines held. Theodoric fell in the chaos, struck down by a stray spear, yet his warriors fought even harder in his name. By nightfall, Attila, for perhaps the only time in his life, was forced to retreat. The Huns hadn't been destroyed, but something critical shifted that day. The myth of Attila's invincibility cracked, and Rome bought itself precious time. Yet why does this titanic struggle fade into history's shadows? Maybe because the Western Empire still fell a few decades later, making Catalaunian Plains feel like a delay rather than a turning point. Or perhaps because later historians, fixated on Rome's collapse, overlooked the moments when its allies stood firm. But here's the truth: without this battle, Attila might have shattered Europe decades before the so-called Dark Ages even began. The Catalaunian Plains wasn't just a battle, it was a fragile dam holding back the flood, and for a brief, brilliant moment it held. In the scorching summer of 636, an outnumbered force stood on the edge of a barren valley, staring down the might of an empire. This was the Battle of Yarmouk, a 6-day storm of strategy and slaughter that reshaped the map forever. While many remember the early Islamic conquests for lightning strikes like the fall of Persia, Yarmouk was something darker, grander. The moment the Byzantine Empire realized it could lose the Levant for good. The Byzantine Emperor Heraclius had thrown everything into this fight. Fresh from beating Persia, he rallied his finest troops, veteran Armenians, Arab Christian allies, even elite heavy cavalry, to crush the rising Muslim armies once and for all. On paper, it should have been a rout, but the Muslim general Khalid ibn al-Walid, nicknamed the Drawn Sword of God, had other plans. What unfolded was a masterclass in deception and grit. Khalid lured the Byzantines into the valley's narrow stretches where their numbers meant nothing. Sandstorms howled across the battlefield, some say divinely sent, blinding Byzantine archers while Muslim warriors exploited every gap. By the fourth day, the Byzantines were exhausted, their water supplies cut off. Then came Khalid's masterstroke, a feigned retreat that pulled the enemy into a deadly trap. As Byzantine ranks broke, thousands tumbled over the cliffs of Wadi Ruqad, their screams lost in the wind. So why does Yarmouk linger in history's shadow? Perhaps because earlier victories like Badr and Uhud stole the spotlight, framed as holy triumphs. Or maybe because Byzantium's slow decline made this loss seem inevitable rather than shocking. But think of it this way: if not for Yarmouk, the cultural heart of the Middle East, Jerusalem, Damascus, Antioch, might have remained Byzantine for centuries. This wasn't just a battle, it was the hinge on which empires turned. And for 6 days in a forgotten valley, the future hung by a thread. Far to the east, where the Silk Road carved paths through towering mountains, an empire's ambitions collided with the rising tide of a new world order. The year was 751, and the Battle of Talas would become one of history's quietest game-changers. A fight most textbooks skip, yet one that subtly redirected the flow of knowledge across continents. The Tang dynasty, China's golden age of power and poetry, had stretched its reach deep into Central Asia. But when their armies met the Abbasid Caliphate's forces near the Talas River, neither side realized they were standing at a crossroads, not just of territory but of technology and culture. For days the battle raged, Chinese infantry locking horns with Arab cavalry under the relentless Central Asian sun. Then something unexpected happened. The Tang's Karluk mercenaries, allies they'd relied on for years, switched sides mid-fight, sealing China's fate in a single treacherous pivot. Military defeat was only half the story. What made Talas unforgettable wasn't just the loss of land, it was what the victors carried home. Among the prisoners taken by the Abbasids were Tang artisans, skilled makers of something far more valuable than weapons: paper. Within decades, paper-making spread like wildfire through the Islamic world, fueling an explosion of scholarship in Baghdad's House of Wisdom. The same craft that had recorded Chinese poetry for centuries would soon preserve the works of Aristotle, the equations of algebra, and the maps that guided explorers. So why does such a pivotal moment languish in obscurity? Perhaps because Talas lacks the drama of empire-shattering sieges or last stands. Or maybe because its most profound impact, the silent migration of ideas, took decades to unfold. But think of it this way: without this forgotten clash, the Renaissance might have flickered out before it ever caught flame. The Battle of Talas didn't just redraw borders, it rewired civilization's memory, one sheet of paper at a time. By the middle of the 10th century, the Magyars had become the terror of Europe, horseback raiders sweeping out of the east like a force of nature. Cities burned, kingdoms trembled, and for decades no army could stop them. Then came a sweltering August day in 955, when a German king named Otto the Great lured them into a trap on the plains of Lechfeld. What unfolded wasn't just a battle, it was the moment Europe finally slammed the door shut on an age of chaos. Otto knew the Magyars' tactics well. Their lightning-fast raids relied on speed and unpredictability, striking soft targets before fading away. So he did something radical: he let them attack first. When the Magyar horsemen descended on his supply train, Otto's troops, hidden in nearby woods, burst out in a deadly pincer move. The Magyars, expecting easy plunder, suddenly found themselves surrounded by armored knights and disciplined infantry. The fight turned into a massacre, with thousands of Magyar warriors cut down or drowned fleeing across the Lech River. But Lechfeld's impact went far beyond body counts. This was the battle that broke the Magyar threat for good, forcing them to abandon raids and settle down as the ancestors of modern Hungarians. For Otto, victory meant more than survival. It solidified his rule, paving the way for the Holy Roman Empire. Yet while figures like Charlemagne or Richard the Lionheart dominate medieval lore, Otto's triumph rarely gets its due. Maybe because decisive stability lacks the drama of crumbling empires or tragic last stands. History remembers flashy conquerors, but Lechfeld reminds us of something quieter and perhaps more vital. This was the battle where Europe stopped running, turned, and fought back. No more would the East's horsemen dictate terms. The age of raids was over. The age of kingdoms had begun. The Mongol tide seemed unstoppable. Cities crumbled, empires vanished, and the very earth trembled under the hooves of their horses until a scorching September day in 1260, when an army of former slaves stood firm in the hills of Palestine. The Battle of Ain Jalut wasn't just another clash. It shattered the myth of Mongol invincibility and rewrote the destiny of the Islamic world. Yet somehow, this watershed moment barely earns a footnote in most history books. The Mamluks, warriors purchased as slaves and trained to perfection, faced off against Hulagu Khan's forces near the spring of Ain Jalut, Arabic for Goliath's Well. The symbolism was lost on no one. The Mongols, fresh from leveling Baghdad and extinguishing the Abbasid Caliphate, expected another easy conquest, but the Mamluk general Saif ad-Din Qutuz had studied their tactics. He lured the Mongols into a narrow valley where their famed cavalry couldn't maneuver, then sprang his trap. What followed was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. The Mamluks used feigned retreats, a Mongol signature move, against them, drawing their vanguard into an ambush where hidden cavalry and elite archers picked them apart. When the dust settled, Hulagu's lieutenant Kitbuka lay dead, and the Mongols retreated in disarray. For the first time, the steppe juggernaut had met an enemy it couldn't break. So why does Ain Jalut linger in obscurity? Partly because the Mongols remained a threat elsewhere, their empire still vast. But the real reason might be simpler. History adores underdog stories, and the Mamluks were no scrappy rebels. They were a professional military caste, their victory as much about discipline as destiny. Yet consider this: had they faltered that day, the Mongols might have surged into Egypt, then beyond. No Mamluk victory, no preservation of centers like Cairo, no safe haven for scholars and artists during the turbulent centuries that followed. Ain Jalut wasn't just a battle. It was the moment the world's most terrifying war machine finally found its match. The golden banners of Christendom fluttered proudly over the Black Sea coast as 20,000 crusaders massed near Varna, their armor gleaming in the autumn sun. It was the year 1444, and they stood on the brink of what should have been a triumphant revival of holy war against the Ottomans. Instead, what unfolded would become one of history's greatest missed opportunities, a single day of bloodshed that sealed the fate of Constantinople and reshaped Europe's future. Pope Eugenius Roman IV had poured everything into this campaign, stitching together an unlikely alliance of Hungarians, Poles, and Wallachans under young King W. Ladislaw Roman III. Their goal was audacious: drive the Ottomans from the Balkans and reclaim lost Christian lands. But Sultan Murad Roman II, a hardened veteran of countless battles, moved faster than anyone expected. When his army of 60,000 appeared on the horizon, the Crusaders found themselves trapped between the sea and an enemy force 3 times their size. What followed was a masterclass in desperation and tactical genius. Against all odds, the Crusaders nearly won. Their heavy cavalry smashed through the Ottoman lines, reaching Murad's very tent before the tide turned. Chaos erupted when Ladislaw, against his general's pleas, led a reckless charge straight into the Sultan's elite janissaries. The king's severed head, mounted on a pike, became the battle's ghastly turning point. By dusk, the Crusader army had ceased to exist, either slaughtered, captured, or drowned, fleeing into the sea. Varna's aftermath rippled across continents. With no army left to challenge him, Murad tightened his grip on the Balkans, strangling Constantinople's lifelines. The Byzantines, hoping for salvation from the west, now stood utterly alone. Yet this crushing defeat rarely gets the attention it deserves, forever eclipsed by the dramatic fall of Constantinople 9 years later. But here's the truth: without Varna, that storied siege might never have happened. Murad's victory didn't just clear the path to the Byzantine capital, it ensured no one would come to save it. History remembers last stands and dramatic collapses, but Varna teaches a harsher lesson. Sometimes it's not the final blow that matters most, but the one that leaves the door wide open. By the time Mehmet the Conqueror raised his banners outside Constantinople's walls in 1453, the real battle for Europe's soul had already been lost on a forgotten shoreline beneath the blood-red banners of Varna. The Indian Ocean in 1509 wasn't just water. It was the world's most coveted chessboard, where empires gambled their futures on the roll of the waves. And on the 3rd of February, off the coast of Douro, Portugal played a hand so bold it redrew the rules of global power. Yet while names like Trafalgar or Lepanto echo through history, this battle, one of the most consequential naval clashes of all time, barely makes a ripple in modern memory. The stage was set by Portugal's insatiable hunger for spice trade control. Their carracks and caravels had outmaneuvered Arab merchants for years, but now they faced something unprecedented: a united Muslim-Indian alliance. The Ottoman Empire, Egypt's Mamluk Sultanate, and Gujarat's naval forces pooled their might, assembling nearly 100 ships to crush the upstart Europeans once and for all. On paper, it should have been a slaughter. Portugal's Viceroy Francisco de Almeida commanded just 18 vessels. What happened next rewrote naval warfare's playbook. Almeida didn't just fight, he exploited every weakness of his enemy's traditional tactics. While the coalition relied on boarding actions, swarming decks with swordsmen, the Portuguese anchored their ships in a lethal crescent, turning their broadside cannons into a fortress of fire. For 2 days, iron and flame tore through wood and sail as the Allies' numerical advantage meant nothing against disciplined gunnery. By the battle's end, thousands lay dead, and Portugal's dominance over the Indian Ocean trade routes was sealed for generations. So why does Douro fade beside later colonial battles? Perhaps because it lacks the drama of land campaigns or the clean narrative of European rivals clashing. But consider this: without Douro, there might never have been a British Raj or Dutch East India Company. This was the moment Europe proved it could project power halfway across the world, not through sheer numbers but through ruthless innovation. The age of gunpowder empires had found its defining roar, and it came not from a continent's heartland, but from the waves off a Gujarati port few can place on a map today. For all its obscurity, Douro's legacy is written in the spice-laden winds that filled Europe's sails for centuries, not with the romance of explorers, but with the thunder of cannons that said the world's currents would now flow west. The sun beat down on the highland city of Cajamarca, where the fate of an empire would be decided not by armies clashing, but by a single, shocking moment of betrayal. It was November 16, 1532, and the Inca ruler Atahualpa, fresh from victory in a brutal civil war, had arrived to meet the strange bearded men who'd emerged from the coast. What followed wasn't just a battle, it was a collision of worlds where steel, gunpowder, and deception shattered the mightiest indigenous empire in the Americas in a single afternoon. Francisco Pizarro's band of 168 conquistadors should have been laughably outmatched. Atahualpa's retinue numbered in the thousands, with loyal warriors and nobles filling Cajamarca's square. But the Spaniards didn't come for fair combat, they came with a trap. When Dominican friar Vicente de Valverde thrust a Bible at Atahualpa, demanding he submit to Christianity, the Inca emperor, unfamiliar with the concept of a book, tossed it aside in confusion. That simple act, misinterpreted as sacrilege, gave Pizarro his excuse. The explosion of gunfire and charging cavalry that followed wasn't warfare, it was carnage designed to terrify. Inca nobles, unarmed as a gesture of diplomacy, were hacked down by Toledo steel. Atahualpa himself was dragged from his litter, becoming the Spaniards' prisoner before his army could react. Casualty estimates vary, but thousands likely perished not from battle, but from the sheer shock of an ambush that defied all Andean rules of engagement. Yet Cajamarca's deeper tragedy lies in what it represents. This wasn't just military defeat, it was the moment colonialism revealed its darkest blueprint. Atahualpa's subsequent ransom, a room filled with gold, couldn't save him from execution, and his empire, already weakened by civil war and smallpox, unraveled with startling speed. Modern accounts often frame this as European superiority, but the truth is messier. Without the Incas' internal divisions, without the cultural gulf that left Atahualpa unprepared for such deception, Pizarro's gamble might have ended in disaster. History remembers Cajamarca as a pivotal conquest, but rarely lingers on its moral weight. Was this bravery or butchery, tactical genius or ruthless exploitation? The battle's legacy lives on not just in Peru's ruins, but in the uncomfortable question of how often civilization has been built on stolen lives. Pizarro got his empire. But the ghosts of Cajamarca still whisper from the Andes, asking us to look closer. By the summer of 1656, Poland stood on the brink of annihilation. Swedish armies, having already overrun the countryside in what became known as the Deluge, now set their sights on Warsaw itself. Yet in a single week of brutal fighting, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, seemingly on its knees, unleashed a counterstrike so fierce it not only saved their capital, but rewrote the destiny of Eastern Europe. King Charles X. Gustav of Sweden had every reason to be confident. His seasoned troops had spent years dismantling Polish resistance, while internal strife and betrayals left the Commonwealth fractured. Warsaw, already captured once by Swedish forces, seemed ripe for the taking, but the Polish commander Stefan Czarnecki turned desperation into genius. Rather than meet the Swedes head-on, he waged a relentless guerrilla campaign, harassing supply lines, ambushing isolated units, and forcing the invaders to fight on terms they'd never trained for. When the decisive clash finally came outside Warsaw's walls, the Swedes faced something unexpected. A Polish army revitalized by sheer defiance. Local peasants, noble cavalry, and even exiled Tatars fought side by side, their coordination honed by months of hit-and-run warfare. The battle raged across fields and marshes, with Polish winged hussars, Europe's last great heavy cavalry, shattering Swedish lines in thunderous charges. By the time Charles X. Gustav ordered a retreat, his dream of dominating the Baltic had evaporated. What makes Warsaw's victory so startling is how swiftly history looked away. While Waterloo or Agincourt became legendary, this clash faded into obscurity, perhaps because Poland's resurgence was short-lived, its eventual partitions overshadowing earlier glories. But consider the stakes. Had Sweden prevailed, the delicate balance of Northern Europe might have tipped permanently. No Polish revival, no later resistance to Ottoman or Russian expansion. The Battle of Warsaw wasn't just a military upset, It was proof that even a nation at its lowest ebb could rally when survival hung in the balance. For a brief, brilliant moment, the deluge's waters receded and Poland refused to drown. By September 12, 1683, Vienna had endured 2 grueling months under siege. The Ottoman Empire, at the peak of its power, had brought Europe to the brink, its cannons pounding the city's walls, its tunnels burrowing beneath them. The defenders, starving and outnumbered, clung to their barricades with fading hope. Then, just as the situation seemed hopeless, a distant thunder echoed across the Kollenberg heights. The winged hussars had arrived. This wasn't just a battle, it was the climax of a 300-year struggle between East and West. The Ottomans, led by Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa, had gambled everything on taking Vienna, the gateway to Europe. But King Jan Roman III Sobieski of Poland, answering the Habsburgs' desperate plea, marched his army nearly 600 kilometers in just 15 days. What followed would hinge on one legendary charge. The Hussars, Europe's last great heavy cavalry, weren't just soldiers, they were a psychological weapon. Clad in gleaming armor, their backs adorned with wooden frames holding eagle feathers that roared like a storm when they galloped, they struck terror into enemies before blades even clashed. As Ottoman troops pressed their final assault, the Polish king ordered his cavalry downhill at midday. 12,000 horsemen descended like a tsunami, their wings casting eerie shadows across the battlefield. The sheer force shattered Ottoman lines, sending shockwaves through an army that had never faced such a spectacle. Yet Vienna's true legacy isn't just in its drama, but its ripple effects. Kara Mustafa's defeat didn't just save a city, it marked the high tide of Ottoman expansion. Never again would they threaten Central Europe so deeply. The battle also accelerated the decline of cavalry's dominance, as musket volleys and trenches began reshaping warfare. But history's irony, while Sobieski's victory preserved Christendom, it was the Habsburgs, not Poland, who reaped the long-term rewards, absorbing Hungary and rising as a European power. Why does Vienna fade behind more famous sieges? Perhaps because its aftermath lacked the clean narrative of a fallen empire. The Ottomans retreated but didn't collapse, their empire lingered for centuries. But in that one afternoon, beneath the wings of charging hussars, the course of a continent was decided. Not with a slow decline, but with a single, earth-shaking gallop. Summer 1709, the Swedish Empire stood at a crossroads. Its legendary warrior King Charles XII had spent years carving a path of victories across Europe, but now his exhausted army faced a new kind of enemy on the sweltering plains of Poltava. This wasn't just another battle, it was the moment Russia announced itself as a force to be reckoned with, and the beginning of the end for Sweden's age of dominance. Peter the Great had spent years preparing for this clash, while Charles relied on the same tactics that had crushed his enemies at Narva: lightning strikes and relentless aggression. Peter had rebuilt Russia's military from the ground up. New training, modern artillery, even standardized uniforms. The difference showed immediately. When the Swedes launched their famous dawn attack, Russian redoubts funneled them into killing zones where cannon fire tore gaps in their ranks. Charles himself, wounded and carried on a stretcher, watched helplessly as his best troops charged straight into disciplined volleys and bayonet walls. What followed was less a battle than a slow-motion collapse. By midday, Swedish lines disintegrated, their survivors fleeing into the woods or captured by the thousands. Charles escaped south to Ottoman exile, but the damage was done. Sweden's golden age died on that Ukrainian field, while Russia's star began its meteoric rise. Yet Poltava's obscurity is almost as fascinating as the battle itself. Overshadowed by Napoleon's later clashes, it lacks the dramatic last stands or tragic glamour that make other battles memorable. But here's what gets overlooked. This victory didn't just make Russia an empire, it redefined Europe's power map. No longer would the Baltic be Sweden's private lake. No longer would Eastern Europe be dismissed as a backwater. Peter's triumph at Poltava set the stage for everything from the Great Northern War's end to Russia's eventual superpower status. Not bad for a battle most people can't place on a map. Sometimes history's quietest turning points are the ones that echo loudest. Poltava didn't just change kings or borders, it shifted the very axis of power, proving that even the mightiest empires can be undone not by a single misstep, but by failing to adapt when the world changes around them. On a sweltering June afternoon in 1757, near the banks of the Bhagirathi River, 2,900 British East India Company troops faced down a 50,000-strong Bengali army. The numbers alone should have spelled disaster, but the Battle of Plassey wasn't won with muskets or courage. It was won with silver, betrayal, and a masterclass in psychological warfare. Robert Clive, the ambitious East India Company officer leading the British forces, understood something his opponents didn't. Real power in Bengal lay not with its Nawab, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, but with the scheming nobles in his court. Clive's secret weapon, Mir Jafar, the Nawab's own commander, who'd been promised the throne in exchange for holding back his troops during the battle. When the fighting began, Jafar's betrayal turned the tide before a single shot was fired. Cannons roared, but nearly two-thirds of Siraj's army stood idle, watching as Clive's disciplined lines crushed the isolated loyalists. What makes Plassey chilling isn't the scale of the battle. Fewer than 100 Britons died, but its consequences. With Bengal under their thumb, the East India Company gained control of the subcontinent's richest province, funding further conquests with its vast treasury. Clive himself became fabulously wealthy, while Bengal spiraled into famine under company mismanagement. The battle didn't just shift power, it revealed colonialism's blueprint: divide, bribe, and conquer. Yet most textbooks treat Plassey as a mere stepping stone, ignoring its darker lessons. Here was the moment a corporate entity, not a kingdom, first seized an empire through backroom deals rather than battlefield glory. The muskets and cannons were almost incidental. The real battle had already been fought in whispers and secret promises. History remembers empires built by swords and sieges, but Plassey forces us to ask, what if the most consequential victories aren't heroic stands but cold calculations? The British didn't just win India with armies, they won it by mastering the art of turning loyalty into currency. And long after the smoke cleared at Plassey, that lesson would echo across continents. Autumn in upstate New York, 1777, a season that should have marked Britain's triumphant stranglehold on the American Revolution. Instead, it became the moment a ragtag rebel army defied all odds and changed history's course. The Battle of Saratoga doesn't just deserve more attention, it deserves to stand shoulder to shoulder with Yorktown as the Revolution's true turning point. Because without Saratoga, there might never have been a Yorktown at all. British General John Burgoyne, nicknamed Gentleman Johnny for his love of finery and theatrics, had a plan so confident it bordered on arrogance. March his army south from Canada, link up with forces from New York City, and slice the rebellious colonies in half. But the wilderness had other ideas. American militiamen felled trees to block roads, snipped supply lines, and picked off redcoat scouts like hunters thinning a herd. By the time Burgoyne reached Saratoga, his men were exhausted, starving, and utterly alone, no reinforcements in sight. What followed wasn't just a battle, it was a masterclass in tactical improvisation. American commander Horatio Gates might lack charisma, but his subordinate Benedict Arnold, still a hero at this point, unleashed a berserker's fury on the battlefield. Against orders, Arnold led a reckless charge that shattered British lines, taking a bullet to the leg but securing victory. The surrender that followed stunned Europe. An entire British army marched into captivity while fifes played Yankee Doodle. Yet Saratoga's real triumph happened an ocean away. In Versailles, news of the rebel victory convinced a hesitant King Louis XVI to gamble on an American alliance. French money, ships, and troops would flood into the war resources without which Washington's starving army could never have trapped Cornwallis at Yorktown 4 years later. So why does Saratoga linger in Yorktown's shadow? Maybe because history loves a clean finale, the spectacle of redcoats laying down their arms while bands played. But Saratoga was messier, grittier, more human. It proved something revolutionary in every sense, that determination could outmaneuver drilled discipline, that a rebellion once dismissed as a nuisance could actually win. Before Saratoga, the revolution was a colonial revolt. After, it became a world war. The fields of upstate New York hold a lesson too often forgotten. Turning points aren't always the final act. Sometimes they're the spark that makes the ending possible. The autumn of 1813 witnessed something Europe had never seen before, a battle so vast it dwarfed entire wars. Over 600,000 soldiers clashed near the Saxon city of Leipzig, turning the plains into a swirling nightmare of smoke and steel. This wasn't just another Napoleonic clash, it was the moment the unstoppable force of France finally met an immovable coalition. Yet while Waterloo gets all the glory, Leipzig was the true beginning of Napoleon's end. Napoleon had spent over a decade bending Europe to his will, but now the tides were turning. Prussia, Russia, Austria, and Sweden had united against him, fielding an army nearly twice the size of his own. What followed over those 4 brutal days was less a battle than a slow-motion unraveling. French troops, exhausted from years of campaigning, found themselves outmaneuvered at every turn. A single misstep, a bridge blown too early, trapped thousands of Napoleon's veterans on the wrong side of the Elster River, drowning or captured. By the time the guns fell silent, over 90,000 men lay dead or wounded, a butcher's bill that made even Austerlitz look tame. Yet Leipzig rarely gets its due. Maybe because Waterloo's drama, Napoleon's last stand, Wellington's stubborn squares makes better theater. But here's the truth, without Leipzig, Waterloo might never have happened. This was the battle that shattered Napoleon's grip on Germany, sent him scrambling back to France with a broken army, and proved his empire was built on sand. The coalition didn't just win a victory, they cracked the myth of French invincibility wide open. The numbers alone should make Leipzig legendary, the largest battle in history until the 20th century, a clash of kings and emperors that decided the fate of continents. Yet history distilled it down to a prelude, a footnote before the finale. But step onto those fields today and the echoes still whisper, this was where the tide truly turned. Not with a single dramatic charge, but with the grinding, relentless weight of a world saying enough. The waters off Greece's Peloponnese coast were eerily calm on October 20, 1827, until the thunder of cannons shattered the silence. This wasn't just another skirmish in the age of sail. It was the curtain call for wooden warships, the moment when Europe's great powers intervened to carve Greece's destiny from the ruins of Ottoman rule. The Battle of Navarino remains history's last great clash of sailing ships, yet for all its drama, it slipped into obscurity, overshadowed by the ironclads and steam engines that followed. The Ottoman fleet, anchored in Navarino Bay alongside Egyptian and Tunisian allies, should have felt secure. Protected by shore batteries and crowded with seasoned sailors, they outnumbered the combined British, French, and Russian squadrons. But what they didn't count on was the Allies' audacity, or their willingness to rewrite the rules of naval warfare. When Ottoman ships fired on a British boat sent to negotiate, the response was apocalyptic. Allied captains, ordered to avoid battle but not to retreat, sailed straight into the bay's cramped waters, turning the Ottomans' own anchorage into a death trap. What unfolded was less a battle than a methodical dismantling. Allied broadsides fired at point-blank range reduced Ottoman ships to floating infernos. By nightfall, over 3/4 of the Sultan's fleet lay at the bottom of the bay, their sails still smoldering. The Allies lost not a single ship. It was a victory so total it shocked even the victors. One British officer called it a scene of horror no pen could describe. Yet Navarino's true legacy lies beyond the carnage. This was the rare moment when Europe's rival powers united not for conquest, but for an idea: Greek independence. Russian Tsars, French liberals, and British admirals all saw something worth fighting for in the Hellenic revival. Within a year, the Ottomans would begrudgingly accept Greek autonomy, setting the stage for modern Greece's birth. So why does such a pivotal battle vanish from popular memory? Perhaps because the age of sail was already waning, its grand finale drowned out by the coming roar of steam engines. Or maybe because Navarino feels too neat, a righteous crusade with clear heroes and villains, lacking the messy ambiguity that makes other conflicts linger in our minds. But here's the truth: without those few chaotic hours in a quiet bay, the map of Europe and the soul of its oldest civilization might look very different today. The smoke has long cleared, but Navarino's echo still ripples through every whitewashed village and ancient temple where the Greek flag flies. Dawn broke over the rocky outcrop of Isandlwana on January 22, 1879, with no hint of the carnage to come. By afternoon, the grasslands ran red. 1,200 British and colonial troops lay dead, their bodies sprawled across the veldt in what would become the worst defeat of a modern army by indigenous forces in history. The Battle of Isandlwana wasn't just a military upset. It was a brutal dismantling of Victorian Britain's myth of racial and technological superiority. The Zulu kingdom, led by King Cetshwayo, faced an impossible choice: submit to British annexation or fight against breech-loading rifles and artillery with spears and cowhide shields. They chose defiance. When British commander Lord Chelmsford split his forces, the Zulu Impis' 20,000 warriors trained in precision maneuvers since childhood pounced like a coiled spring. What followed was a masterclass in tactical encirclement. Zulu regiments used the terrain to mask their advance, closing the gap before redcoats could reload. The British formations, stretched thin and unprepared for close combat, were overrun in a frenzy of stabbing assegai spears. Yet for all its drama, Isandlwana lives in the shadow of its sister battle Rorke's Drift, where a tiny British garrison held off thousands of Zulus the next day. That heroic last stand became legendary, immortalized in films and medals, while Isandlwana was buried under excuses: faulty ammunition, arrogant leadership, anything to avoid admitting the Zulus' martial brilliance. But here's what imperial narratives gloss over. The Zulus didn't win by luck or numbers alone. Their victory came from discipline, battlefield intelligence, and a deep understanding of their enemy's weaknesses. The real tragedy of Isandlwana isn't just the lives lost, but how its lessons were twisted. Britain spun the disaster into a rallying cry, using Rorke's Drift to erase the stain of defeat. The Zulu War ended with scorched earth tactics and the kingdom's dismantling, but for one searing afternoon, the world saw the impossible: a pre-industrial society outmaneuvering the empire where the sun never set. Isandlwana forces us to ask whose stories get remembered and whose get rewritten. The answer lies not in the battle's bloodshed, but in the silence that followed. The horizon off the Korean Strait erupted in fire on May 27, 1905, not with the slow burn of naval tradition, but with the precision of a surgeon's blade. The Russian Baltic Fleet had spent 8 agonizing months sailing halfway around the world to reach the Far East, only to meet annihilation at the hands of Japan's Admiral Togo Hayakairo. The Battle of Tsushima wasn't just a victory, it was a seismic crack in the bedrock of colonialism, proving for the first time that an Asian nation could dismantle a European empire's might on the open sea. Russia's fleet entered those waters already crippled, exhausted from their 18,000-mile journey, their hulls fouled with seaweed, their crews demoralized by outbreaks of disease. But arrogance blinded them. They expected another Port Arthur, where bungled tactics and luck had spared them before. What they got was a masterclass in modern naval warfare. Togo's ships, faster and better trained, executed a daring crossing the T maneuver, raking the Russian line with concentrated fire. Within hours, 21 Russian ships were sunk or captured, including 8 battleships. The Baltic Fleet effectively ceased to exist. Tsushima's aftershocks reverberated far beyond the seafloor littered with Russian iron. For centuries, European powers had justified colonialism with the myth of racial and technological superiority. But here was Japan, a nation that had industrialized in mere decades, outgunning one of history's most formidable empires. The victory electrified anti-colonial movements from India to Vietnam, proving European dominance wasn't divine right, just brittle artifice, yet the battle's legacy cuts deeper than symbolism. Tsushima forced the world to acknowledge Japan as a peer, shifting global power dynamics overnight. It accelerated Russia's revolutionary unrest, emboldened American naval expansion, and even influenced World War I's dreadnought arms race. Most ironically, the very tactics Togo perfected would inspire the Pearl Harbor attack 36 years later, a bitter echo of his triumph. History remembers Tsushima not for its body count, but for its unbearable truth. Empires rise and fall on the tides of adaptation. That day in the Strait, the waves didn't just carry shattered hulls, they carried the future, reshaped by an admiral who refused to believe the world's order was set in stone. By late August 1914, 2 colossal armies lumbered toward each other in the dense forests of East Prussia. One stumbling forward in chaos, the other moving with chilling precision. The Battle of Tannenberg should have been Russia's moment to crush Germany between 2 advancing armies. Instead, it became one of history's most devastating encirclements, a triumph so complete it erased an entire army from the map. Yet ask anyone to name a World War I battle, and they'll likely mention the Somme or Verdun long before Tannenberg. The Eastern Front never got its due, but the men who fought here deserved none of the obscurity. Russia's grand plan was textbook military strategy, a pincer movement. 2 armies, the first and second, would advance into German territory from the east and south, squeezing the defenders like a vise. But poor coordination and garbled radio messages left them dangerously separated. Enter Germany's 8th Army, led by the unlikely duo of Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff. They saw opportunity where others saw disaster. While Russian General Alexander Samsonov's 2nd Army trudged forward, exhausted and undersupplied, the Germans pulled off a maneuver that would make Hannibal proud. Railroads became their secret weapon. Shifting troops with ruthless efficiency, the Germans left only a skeleton force to delay the Russian First Army while encircling Samsonov's forces near the tiny village of Tannenberg. The Russians, marching in sweltering heat with no reconnaissance, walked straight into the trap. By the time they realized what was happening, machine guns and artillery rained down from all sides. Roads became slaughterhouses, forests turned into graveyards. Nearly 92,000 Russian soldiers were captured. Another 30,000 lay dead or wounded. Samsonov, rather than face disgrace, walked into the woods and shot himself. What makes Tannenberg extraordinary isn't just the scale of victory, it's how thoroughly it dismantled preconceptions. This wasn't the muddy stalemate of the Western Front, but a lightning strike that proved mobility and cunning still had a place in modern war. Yet history sidelined it, partly because Germany's eastern triumphs couldn't compensate for eventual defeat in the West, partly because the narrative of World War I became one of senseless attrition rather than brilliant tactics. But step back and the irony is striking. This battle, named in medieval revenge for a Teutonic defeat 5 centuries earlier, showcased a general staff at its peak, only to be overshadowed by the very trench warfare it sought to avoid. Tannenberg wasn't just a battle, it was the last gasp of a vanishing art, the moment before the machine gun and barbed wire locked Europe into a bloodier, grimmer kind of war. November 20, 1917. The fields near Cambrai, France, lay eerily quiet, no thunderous artillery barrage, no screaming infantry charges. Then, without warning, the ground itself seemed to shudder awake. 372 British tanks, their steel hulls painted in jagged camouflage, lurched forward in unison. The Battle of Cambrai wasn't just another World War I bloodbath. It was the moment warfare itself evolved before the world's eyes, only to be forgotten in the mud of later trench battles. For years, the Western Front had been a nightmare of static lines and futile charges, but Cambrai offered something radical: surprise. Instead of bombarding German positions for weeks, tipping them off, the British attacked in silence, letting their new secret weapon lead the way. Tanks tore through barbed wire like it was string, their treads crushing machine gun nests as infantry followed in sheltered lanes. Within hours, they'd punched a hole 5 miles deep in the German line, a breakthrough unimaginable since the war's early days. Yet Cambrai's brilliance was also its tragedy. British commanders, stunned by their own success, failed to press the advantage. Reserves arrived too late, and within days, German counterattacks reclaimed most of the lost ground. The battle ended as a tactical draw, but its lessons were anything but neutral. For the first time, tanks proved they could be more than mechanical curiosities. They were the key to breaking trench deadlock. So why does Cambrai fade behind the Somme or Passchendaele? Partly because its gains didn't last, partly because World War I's narrative became one of senseless slaughter rather than innovation. But look closer, the Germans took notes. Cambrai's blueprint: concentrated armor, sudden strikes, combined arms, would resurface 20 years later under a new name: Blitzkrieg. History remembers failures and Pyrrhic victories, but Cambrai asks us to consider the battles that almost changed everything. The tanks that rolled across those fields weren't just machines, they were the future, rumbling into a world not quite ready to listen. The Mongolian steppe stretched silent under the August sun in 1939, a vast, windswept stage for a clash that would alter the course of World War II before it even officially began. The Battle of Khalkhin Gol didn't just pit Soviet tanks against Japanese infantry. It quietly reshaped global strategy in ways neither side could have anticipated. Japan's Kwantung Army had been testing Soviet resolve along the disputed Mongolian frontier for months, probing for weakness. But when they crossed the Khalkhin Gol River that summer, they triggered a response far fiercer than expected. The Soviets, led by an obscure general named Georgy Zhukov, didn't just defend, they unleashed a preview of the brutal mechanized warfare that would later crush Nazi Germany. Over 1,000 tanks, backed by relentless air support and artillery, smashed into Japanese lines with terrifying precision. What makes Khalkhin Gol so pivotal isn't the body count, though thousands perished, but its invisible consequences. The crushing defeat forced Japan's military planners to reconsider their northern ambitions. Faced with the Red Army's overwhelming firepower, they pivoted southward, setting their sights on the oil-rich colonies of Southeast Asia instead. That decision, born on Mongolia's barren plains, would lead directly to Pearl Harbor and the Pacific War. Yet history textbooks often skip this battle entirely. Maybe because it lacks the drama of Stalingrad or Midway's carrier duels. But here's what gets lost. Khalkhin Gol was Zhukov's proving ground, the testing lab for tactics he'd later use against Hitler. It also exposed a fatal flaw in Japan's military thinking. Their fanatical devotion to infantry charges, honed in China, crumbled against modern combined arms. The true legacy of this forgotten clash lies in its whispers. When Japanese diplomats signed a neutrality pact with Moscow in 1941, freeing Stalin to focus on the Nazi threat, it was Khalkhin Gol's shadow that guided their pens. A battle barely remembered became the quiet architect of the Pacific's fiery dawn. Spring 1944. As the world held its breath for D-Day, another battle raged in the shadow of the Himalayas, one that would decide the fate of Asia. The twin sieges of Imphal and Kohima didn't just stop Japan's march toward India. They shattered an empire's momentum with brutal hand-to-hand desperation. Yet while history books trumpet Normandy's beaches, these jungle-clad ridges remain overlooked despite Churchill himself calling them Britain's greatest battle. Picture this: 30,000 British and Indian troops surrounded on three sides by 80,000 fanatical Japanese soldiers, supply lines cut. Monsoon rains turning hillsides into slippery graves. At Kohima, the fighting grew so close that opposing trenches were dug just yards apart, so near that enemies could hear each other's whispers. The climax came on the district commissioner's tennis court, where bayonets and grenades replaced rackets and balls in a slaughterhouse scrap for control of the road to India. What makes Imphal Kohima extraordinary isn't just the stakes, but the sheer improbability of victory. Unlike the Western Front's industrial carnage, this was a battle of wills. Japanese troops, trained to die rather than retreat, launched human wave attacks night after night. But the Allied defenders, a patchwork of British regulars, Gurkhas and Naga tribesmen, refused to break. When supplies ran low, airdrops kept them alive. When ammunition dwindled, they fought on with kukri knives and bare fists. The real tragedy: how quickly the world looked away. By June, D-Day's drama had stolen the spotlight, leaving Imphal Kohima to fade into obscurity. But consider the ripple effects. Had these positions fallen, Japan might have plunged India into chaos, reshuffling the entire Pacific War's chessboard. Instead, their army suffered losses so catastrophic, 53,000 dead, that they never launched another major offensive. History loves its grand narratives, its sweeping beachheads and tank battles. But sometimes the true turning points happen in the mud and mist of forgotten ridges, where the only witnesses are the rusting helmets and overgrown trenches. Imphal Kohima wasn't just a battle, it was the moment an empire's hunger met an unbreakable line, and quietly, without fanfare, that line held. The jungle-clad valleys of northwest Vietnam hid a grim secret in early 1954. What began as a French attempt to lure communist guerrillas into a conventional battle instead became the graveyard of colonial ambition. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu wasn't just a military defeat, it was the moment an empire learned that no amount of artillery or foreign legionnaires could hold back the tides of history. French strategists thought they'd chosen the perfect killing ground, a remote basin surrounded by hills where their paratroopers could establish an impregnable fortress. But Viet Minh commander Vo Nguyen Giop turned their arrogance against them. While French officers sipped wine in their bunkers, Giop's troops did the impossible, hauling heavy artillery piece by piece up mountain trails, camouflaging guns in caves and transforming the high ground into a siege ring of steel. When the first shells rained down on the airfield, cutting off supplies and reinforcements, the French realized too late they weren't the hunters, they were the trap. For 56 grueling days, the valley became a meat grinder. Monsoon rains turned trenches into coffins, dysentery ravaged both sides, and wave after wave of Viet Minh assaults chipped away at French defenses. The colonial powers' technological edge meant nothing when resupply planes couldn't land under anti-aircraft fire, or when their elite paratroopers found themselves fighting hand-to-hand in flooded trenches against tenacious guerrillas. By May 7th, when the Viet Minh flag finally rose over the French command bunker, nearly 10,000 lay dead or wounded, 3/4 of them on the losing side. Yet Dien Bien Phu's true shockwaves weren't just counted in casualties. This was the first time a non-European army had decisively crushed a colonial power in pitched battle, proving guerrilla tactics could evolve to conquer conventional forces. The Geneva Accords that followed didn't just end French rule in Indochina, they sent a signal to liberation movements worldwide that empires weren't invincible. So why does this watershed moment often get reduced to a prelude for America's Vietnam War? Maybe because Western narratives struggle to spotlight defeats that dismantled colonial myths. But the truth remains, beneath Dien Bien Phu's smoldering wreckage lay the blueprint for every asymmetric war to come. Not with a whimper, but with thunderous finality, the age of empire met its match in those rain-sodden hills, and the world would never look at revolution the same way again. The dusty plains of Punjab became a killing ground in September 1965, where nearly 1,000 tanks collided in a steel hurricane the world barely noticed. While Cold War tensions fixated on Berlin and Cuba, Pakistan and India fought the largest armored clash since World War II near the tiny village of Chawinda, a battle so massive it made the famed tank duels of the Eastern Front look like skirmishes. Yet ask anyone today and they'll likely draw a blank. Pakistan's strategy was bold: launch Operation Grand Slam to sever India's supply lines in Kashmir. But when Indian forces counterattacked near Chawinda, the conflict exploded into something neither side expected. For 3 brutal days, Patton tanks clashed with Centurions across sugarcane fields and irrigation canals, their cannons turning idyllic farmland into a scorched wasteland. At its peak, nearly 400 tanks were locked in point-blank duels, their crews fighting as much against heat exhaustion and cramped turrets as enemy fire. What makes Chawinda extraordinary isn't just the scale, it's the irony. Both armies were armed with cast-off Western hardware, American Pattons for Pakistan, British Centurions for India. This wasn't just a regional conflict, it was a proxy war fought with Cold War hand-me-downs, yet ignored by the superpowers who supplied them. The battle raged while Washington and Moscow were too busy staring each other down to notice their own weapons turning the subcontinent into a live fire testing ground. The silence that followed was just as telling. With neither side able to claim decisive victory, both nations spun the narrative toward stalemate. Chawinda became a footnote, buried under diplomatic spin and Cold War grandstanding. But for the villagers who still plow up shell casings with their crops, and the veterans who remember the metallic stench of burning armor, this was the moment the Third World proved it could stage a conflict to rival anything in Europe. History often writes its epics where the cameras are pointing, yet sometimes the real tremors happen offstage, in places like Chawinda, where the earth shook under the weight of forgotten giants, and the echoes of cannon fire faded into the wind, ignored by a world too distracted to listen. October 3, 1993, a sweltering afternoon in Mogadishu where a routine mission spiraled into 18 hours of carnage that would redefine modern warfare. Hollywood's Black Hawk Down burned the Battle of Mogadishu into popular memory with its visceral chaos. But the real story isn't just about helicopters falling from the sky or heroic last stands. It's about how one firefight in a labyrinth of alleys reshaped America's role on the global stage. The operation was supposed to be simple: capture warlord Mohammed Farah Aidid's lieutenants and exit swiftly. But when 2 Black Hawks crashed in the heart of hostile territory, elite Delta Force operators and Army Rangers found themselves trapped in a nightmare. Somali militias armed with RPGs and Kalashnikovs swarmed from every direction, turning the city into a kill zone. The street fighting grew so intense that some American soldiers ran out of ammunition, resorting to hand-to-hand combat in the dusty shadows of crumbling buildings. 18 U.S. servicemen died that day, alongside hundreds, perhaps thousands of Somalis. Yet the battle's true impact wasn't measured in body counts. Those 18 hours forced Washington to confront the limits of intervention. The images of dead soldiers dragged through the streets broadcast worldwide sent shockwaves through the Pentagon and White House. Within months, President Clinton ordered a full withdrawal from Somalia, a retreat that echoed far beyond Mogadishu. Future conflicts, from Rwanda's genocide to Bosnia's ethnic cleansing, would unfold without American boots on the ground as policymakers hesitated, haunted by Mogadishu's ghost. The irony: while Black Hawk Down immortalized the bravery of individual soldiers, it glossed over the battle's geopolitical aftershocks. This wasn't just a tactical failure, it was a seismic shift in how America engaged with global crises. The specter of another Somalia loomed over every decision, delaying interventions where they might have saved lives and accelerating others where they shouldn't have happened. Mogadishu's legacy isn't just in the bullets fired or medals earned. It's in the unspoken calculus of every modern intervention, the fear of getting stuck in another urban quagmire where victory has no definition and the cost is measured in more than just blood. The battle didn't just change Somalia, it rewrote the rules of when and whether the world's most powerful military would step into the fray. And somewhere between the silver screen's heroics and the history book's footnotes, that lesson remains etched in the scorched earth of a forgotten city. So here we are at the end of our march through history's shadowed corners, 25 battles that shook the world, then slipped into the margins. How does a clash that topples empires or rewires global trade just vanish? Sometimes it's the winners who write the textbooks, airbrushing out their close calls. Other times, history's spotlight gets hogged by flashier wars, leaving pivotal moments buried in the footnotes. And let's be honest, some stories get lost simply because they're messy, uncomfortable, or don't fit the neat arcs we prefer. But here's the thing, every forgotten battle is a crack in the mirror we hold up to the past. What if we've been missing the full picture because we kept staring at the same few frames? Maybe the real lesson isn't just about spears and sieges, but about questioning whose voices got amplified and whose got erased. For every Thermopylae, there's a Catalaunian Plains. For every Waterloo, a Plassey. So I'll leave you with this, grab a shovel and start digging. History isn't a monument, it's a conversation, and we've barely scratched the surface. Dive into the books, chase the rabbit holes, and most importantly, ask why. Why do we remember what we remember, and which of these battles jolted you the most? Drop it in the comments. I'm genuinely curious, because the best thing about forgotten history, it's never truly gone, just waiting for someone to listen.